When I started out making landscape photographs, it was really important for me to try to decipher how to construct, how to represent, and how to apprehend the landscape. And it seemed to me that the easy solution was always sky and foreground. But how do you complicate that? And so I think that I understood from studying landscape architects as well as Bruegel, that notion of bringing someone into the land and guide them throughout the landscape, either, using a path, having a tree, having a group here, and somehow giving the viewer a kind of physical experience and using scale to do that. And Bruegel was certainly somebody that I looked at very early on to try to understand how to dissect the landscape.
I think that the first thing I thought of when I saw this painting was that sense of scale that I think you employ as well, but also the sense of celebration of common people and labor and how that intersects with the landscape. Because of course, this is a hay harvest painted in 1565. So a very
Um,
well-known painting, The Gleaners, has been called an epic hymn to labor. And I think there's so much about this painting we could talk about. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I saw this painting in person and reproduced, very, very early on when I was probably not even a photographer yet. And it always stuck in my mind because it is extremely beautiful from the way he painted the light, he described the air. It seems like an early morning moment, but at the same time, the description of the backbending labor, the repetition, all of that is in there. So it's that sense of the layering of the effort, the labor, the repetition, the gesture, this kind of, it's not such a difficult, complex gesture, but there's a kind of expertise in the way they stretch their arms out, the way they bend, the way the arm is crossed above the back that I always remembered. And so when I had to make a photograph about laborers, somehow this came back in my mind, and certainly it influenced me.
It's interesting too, because this painting was made on the heels of the French Revolution and was criticized at the moment of its first showing because of the fact that it was glorifying lower class workers, which made the prosperous class uncomfortable. And it strikes me that we're kind of returning to a moment like this. So it also points to this cycle within history that tends to repeat
Yeah.
itself and that we see in art history since it's a reflection of the culture we're living in.
Certainly, it was not a topic that was quote unquote worthy, but Millet was definitely the first to kind of apply this realism in
Mhm.
painting.
So this is a pairing I chose because I'm interested in the sense of landscape traditions and civilization. And it's two paintings from a series of five that points to the inevitable cycle in the construction of civilization. So on the left, you have the first state, the wild state, and on the right, the desolation, which actually looks pretty romantic if you ask me. But it does kind of point to this expansive point of view that I think you utilize as well, the sense of pulling back to reveal as much as possible about the landscape and about what is happening upon it, both in terms of the frame, but through time as well.
And it's that cyclical pattern that I find so fascinating. I think growing up, I always heard about post Vietnam War, I was heard about the lessons of Vietnam. And I think before I knew, we were engaging in a new war with Iraq. Same with the Confederate monuments that we'll see a few of soon. That notion that history doesn't move in a straight line, and we often take many steps back and hopefully continue moving forward.
And like you, I think there's a sense in these paintings that nature persists, that nature is sort of always larger than human culture in some ways. So then there's the question of landscape traditions and national identity. So this is sort of the epic American historical painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which depicts his attack on the Hessians at Trenton on November 25th, 1776, which is sort of this moment that is written into the history of our country. It's a kind of a picture that attempts to capture the glory of us wresting our freedom from the British Empire. And I find it interesting to think about how this painting relates to where we are as a country now.
I think that in your excellent essay in the catalog, you talk about manifest destiny and that notion of Americans feeling it's their mission to conquer and to spread democracy. And it seems that throughout the different projects I've made, it refers to certain aspects or certain iterations of that notion of manifest destiny, whether we're talking about American foreign policy with Vietnam, or we're talking about dealing with, contending with the history of slavery in the United States and racial injustice, or the conquering of the West by the Eastern states.
Now for something luminous, this beautiful Turner painting. When did you first see this painting?
I saw this is actually not the painting that I photographed, which is another Turner that was being restored. But I had seen this at the Yale British Art Center. I think I saw my first Turner probably in Paris in the 80s. And I was always struck by the way he described not just the ship and the historical moment of the British Navy, but it's also about the air and the atmosphere and the water and that sense of the ineffable that really struck me. And I think as he continued in his career and grew older, it seemed that the ship started disappearing, and then it was mostly about clouds and about the air. And I think those are absolutely breathtaking.
It's a really peaceful and serene painting too. It kind of gives me a sense of calm, which I think is interesting in thinking about your work too, because you are photographing conflict and yet they are quite serene and calm photographs.
Canaletto, I looked at his work when I started traveling with the Navy to try to understand the different possibilities of how to describe ships. And of course, Gustave Le Gray, Canaletto, Turner, I looked at all of them. What I learned was that Canaletto's father was a kind of scenery painter. You know, he drew sets. And I always thought that there was something kind of very stagey and artificial about the lighting in these. And it makes me think that perhaps it comes from that training that he had with his father.
They are very theatrical. They do give you a sense of daily life, but in a kind of airless world.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, you know, the photographs are stuffed with little boats and dinghies, and I never thought I would be in a situation where I would find so many little boats, but it did happen.
Yeah, and there's a similar sense of that expansiveness of wanting to capture as much detail as possible and using light to your advantage. So now we move into photographs. These are both by Eugene Atget, a French photographer whose career spanned the 19th and 20th century. Really beautiful pastoral pictures, perhaps lesser known than some of his others, of the streets of Paris.
Yeah, so he has been a great influence in my work. I think the work that most people don't know is the kind of inventory and typology work he did as a commission for the city of Paris in the early 1900s, recording different types of gates and different stairwells, and then also recording the destruction of Paris as housemen urbanized the city. The apple tree was made early on in his life, and I was always struck by those trees because they seem to be about abundance and they seem to be about this kind of richness in the trees. And the sculpture at Saint Cloud was done much later. I think that his late photographs are very mysterious and much more expressionistic than the early work, and they seem to be about this sort of subconscious moment that is all poetry. It's what photography does at its best. It's descriptive, it's about evidence, but at the same time, it's this beautiful mystery.
And again, that sense of atmosphere that
Yeah.
you're able to create. So we move a little bit further into the sort of unification of art and life, and perhaps even of storytelling with Manet, Luncheon on the Grass, which I'm sure is familiar to many people. But perhaps we don't remember how shocking it was when it was first shown, because it rejected the sense of nudity was only shown in allegorical scenes. And here she is in a picnic that could be something you were meant to attend. But again, you get a sense of scale in this painting as well.
So you have this very intimate moment, but at the same time, it's so beautifully set within this patch of forest, and there's even someone else in the back there doing something. So it's always that sense of scale that is so interesting to me, and of course the relationship between the three people, the kind of how casual it's kind of a risque and momentous moment, but they seem so casual about it. I think it's the kind of painting that makes you want to stop and look at for a really long time.
It is a
And
mysterious painting even now. It's a really fantastic painting by Carrie James Marshall. You know, another vision of a picnic, but a very different kind of picnic. Perhaps one that looks more fun to attend.
definitely, I was struck by that's the relationship between what is intimate also and something very epic here. You know, how do you describe that moment that this family is experiencing? It's a beautiful moment while also suggesting, a much larger world that is surrounding their unit. And it's that collision between something small, unified, and something much larger that is always so interesting to me.
Yeah,
Um,
it's both the personal, the cultural, and the universal, which is really hard, I think, to capture in one image or one painting. And I think you do that as well.